Hi, and welcome to Is That Even Constitutional? This is a show where we use the lens of the Constitution to dissect current events. My name is Sadhana Devaraja, and I am not a constitutional scholar, but lucky for me, my friend Ken Thomas is. Hi, Ken. How are you?
I'm great, Sadhana. How are you?
I am doing well. As folks probably know, we're in our second season. The Project 2026 series is what we're calling it. And we are setting forth 10 winnable proposals this season that would help us reclaim the Constitution through legislation. Today, we're on our 8th proposal of that arc. In the episodes before this, we covered ending the filibuster, ending gerrymandering, making Election Day a national holiday, setting term limits for the Supreme Court, ending the Electoral College, making DC a state, talking about the right to plan your family. And then today we're going to be talking about limiting corporate speech. If you're interested in any of those previous topics and didn't get to listen to that episode yet, recommend you go back and take a listen. So with limiting corporate speech, I think one of the most popularly cited parts of the Constitution is the right to free speech. I hear it colloquially pretty frequently. It gets invoked. Whether people cite it exactly right or not is another issue, but it's probably one of a handful of parts of the Constitution that Americans realize is in there. And so the right to free speech is enshrined in the First Amendment, which reads, and I'm going to read it exactly as it is: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So this essentially has meant that the U.S. government can't censor your expression, your ideas, your opinions. It's covered spoken, written, symbolic actions like words on a shirt, kind of wearing armbands, things like that. And I know that would come up a lot when in my schooling, maybe in that colloquially referenced way of like, oh, they're inhibiting my right to free speech. But it has limitations, right? It doesn't protect certain categories of types of speech, and it primarily applies to like government actions not being able to restrict you. Today, like I said, we want to talk about limiting corporate speech, which isn't mentioned on its face in the text that I read. So if we can start off, Ken, I'm wondering, like, do corporations have rights under the Constitution? And specifically, do they have rights to free speech?
So that's a great question, Sadhana. I think I'd like to start with a anecdote some people probably don't remember. Mitt Romney was a candidate for the presidency, and during his campaign, he was speaking at a fair in Iowa in about 2011, and he was being heckled, and he was being heckled by people who were calling for corporate taxes, and he said something that got him laughed at, as we'll discuss, may not have been completely inaccurate. And what he said was, corporations are people, my friends. This obviously did not make the hecklers feel any better, but to some extent, he was not completely wrong. Now, we know that most fundamental political rights are rights that are assigned to people in the Constitution, but corporations, in some instances, can be legal persons. Now, why is this the case? Well, if you think about it for a bit, it actually makes a certain amount of sense, especially for certain rights. So, for instance, think about it. Corporations are owned by shareholders. Now, why are shareholders part of a corporation? Well, shareholders are essentially people who have come together to buy stocks and to engage in some kind of investment, but the corporation limits their financial exposure. So the most you can lose is the amount of money you put into this corporation. So if you think about it, the rights of the shareholders are rights that the Constitution would protect to the extent that they are something like property rights. So if a corporation is sued and goes into a court, they're still going to have some of the basic rights that you would expect for anybody going into a court. They're going to have due process rights. They're going to have the rights to an impartial hearing by, under rules of evidence. And they're going to be protected by equal protection. They won't be discriminated against unreasonably. They'll have some Fourth Amendment restrictions so that they can't be just a search and seizure that's unreasonable against them. So you can understand how corporations can have rights because, in general, the idea is that the corporate rights are really just reflection of the underlying shareholder rights. The shareholders have property rights, and so the Constitution would protect those property rights. Now, there are other rights that we consider more personal rights that corporations do not get. For instance, corporations, interestingly enough, don't have protections against rights of self-incrimination. They can't basically refuse to answer questions because it might incriminate them, and because that is held to be a personal property right. So this raises the question that we'll be addressing today. What about the First Amendment? Well, the First Amendment, as we're talking about, in this case, is probably going to be for the kind of speech that we think of as either political or policy speech. And the real question is whether corporations are going to be given free speech rights. Now, there's a second part of the First Amendment beside free speech, which talks about free association, and that would protect the right of individuals to get together in a corporation and to have political speech. And we see this in groups that try to, for instance, gather together in order to have public interest public interest speech. But there's also many corporations that are created just for economic reasons, and the question is whether or not they are going to have free speech rights. And the Supreme Court did find that the corporations do have free speech. This was in the case of Citizens United versus FEC, which is essentially a case that held that corporations are going to be exercising this personal right or this personal fundamental right protected under the First Amendment.
That's fascinating. Thanks, Ken. So, if I'm capturing it right, corporations are owned by people. And so it makes sense that we would want to protect the corporation to the extent that you want to protect the people behind the corporation. And then there's this interesting kind of interplay with the other part of the First Amendment that talks about freedom of association, where, we also want individuals to be able to join together because we see power in numbers and association in that way. And so kind of these two pieces interplayed got heightened kind of in Citizens United versus FEC, where corporations were then interpreted to have this like new status as individuals with free speech rights, kind of stemming from those origins. And so, in that way, does this decision make sense? Is that like a natural progression of how free speech should have gone?
Well, a lot of people actually argue that this extension of the free speech rights to the corporation did not make a lot of sense. If you think about what we were talking about, why corporations might want to have given constitutional rights, this really goes to property rights. And speech is really not a property right. And you can also argue that there's a real disconnect between the free speech of the shareholders and the free speech of the corporations. As I'm sure you know, corporations don't generally ask shareholders for permission to do anything. As a matter of fact, it is probably the case that managements often fight when shareholders try to get involved in the management of the corporation. For instance, when environmental groups are encouraging people to hold their corporation for shareholders to hold their corporations to certain requirements, management will often fight these shareholder rights, both in particular instances, and they'll fight laws that try to give shareholders more right. So shareholders really have very little power over corporate speech. So if a corporation decides to engage in political speech, for instance, to give money to advertise, for or against particular policy, particular politicians, shareholders really have very little control over this. So Citizens United was a very, very big deal. Before Citizens United, corporations or labor unions essentially were very limited in their ability to engage directly in political speech. And when Citizens United was created, suddenly the dams were open and huge amounts of money were allowed to flow into the idea of political speech. This has influenced corporate speech in the public sphere. State elections are breaking spending records. And now we have money from our biggest donors being the most influential money, or at least the most largest amount of money going into different elections. So Citizens United was not a intellectual exercise, but it was a massive decision regarding how our elections were going to be funded.
So, if I'm following this right, corporations are owned by people. We want to protect them to the extent that we're protecting people because they're owning this property. But free speech isn't about property rights, and it's fundamentally about a different issue. It's meant to address something different. And so, the application of free speech for this type of protection that we want for corporate owners feels a little misplaced. And then you went into how corporate money is now being implicated. There's like a bit of a leap there. So money is free speech, more like the spending of money is free speech. I'm guessing it's because money is needed to enable the written or spoken positions of these corporations. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Money being considered speech actually goes back many years to a case called Bellotti that was essentially holding that corporations could engage in free speech and that the regulation or the corporations could basically submit money for purposes of speech. Whether or not this could go directly to political speech was something that was not decided until a bit later. So what we had before Citizens United was actually a very, very complex situation for the involvement of corporations in public speech. So campaign finance is something that is beyond the scope of our discussion here, but let's just say that there are distinctions between the ability to give money directly to candidates so that these contributions are then used by the candidates. Then there was a whole scenario where corporations were allowed to set up PACs where they didn't put their own money, but they encouraged other people to put money in and then they controlled where it went. So what we're really talking about for Citizens United is independent expenditures. And this is a situation where corporations are spending money, not giving it to politicians, not coordinating with politicians, but they're just making their own decisions about how this money is going to be used, for instance, for advertising or get out the vote. What's kind of interesting about independent expenditures is that political parties and political candidates are not always that happy with independent expenditures because sometimes they're trying to put out one message, whereas people who are spending independent expenditures might put out another. But in general, it is considered very, very potentially influential on campaigns or on different elections when there is a lot of independent expenditures. So, what is really happening with campaign independent expenditures is that it is blowing up the costs of elections. So, for instance, in 2024, California and New York City had some state elections that broke records for political advertising. The amount of money spent was beyond anything that had been spent before. In New Jersey, we had a $200 million governor's race, which was the most expensive race in the state's history. In Virginia, we had a $40 million campaign for the state attorney general, which is really not even the head of a ticket, but it was the most expensive attorney general election ever in the history of the country. In Pennsylvania, we had Supreme Court justices who are up for reelection. There was a $15 million campaign or amount of money spent in that case. And then finally, California Prop 50, which was a proposal to let the California state legislature essentially gerrymander to get more Democratic House candidates elected. This was done in response to President Donald Trump insisting that Republican states gerrymander. California Prop 50 had the highest expenditures on a proposition ever in California. So Citizens United is having a continuing effect and an increasing effect on our population and how it elects people.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so, like, hearing the amount of money that's going into these races, especially things like just judges and justices and attorney generals, it kind of signals to me that like people want to spend their money in this way or are like condoning it at least. I mean, so is the decision in Citizens United unpopular?
Well, so interestingly enough, the money that's being spent on independent expenditures tends to be coming from a relatively small number of either very rich corporations or to some extent it's individual citizens. So Citizens United is a remarkably unpopular decision. 80% of Americans think that there's too much money in political campaigns, and they believe that Citizens United is a big part of that. And for this reason, there are proposals to essentially change the law regarding Citizens United. Now, the what appeared to be the most obvious thought here would be to amend the Constitution to provide for independent expenditures. I worked on Capitol Hill and I was actually involved in some significant number of meetings where people wanted to essentially say, well, we'll just strip the corporations of constitutional rights or free speech rights. And these were ideas that were floated around. Nothing really ever came of it. And there are still some groups and individual politicians who are still making this kind of argument, but there's really been very little movement on the idea of constitutional amendments. Constitutional amendments are very, very hard to pass. And even though Citizens United is very unpopular, it still might be difficult to get the politicians in Congress who might have their own opinions on this to propose a constitutional amendment and then to get it passed by three-fifths of the states. So one other proposal that is out there and is much simpler is a proposal that could be passed by legislation only. And this is the proposal basically to tie together those rights that the Citizens United case split apart, and that's the rights of the shareholders and what we now have is in some ways corporate rights to speech. And the way to tie these together is to require corporations to get permissions from their shareholders if they're going to engage in corporate speech. Now, the Congress and the states actually, but Congress has the authority to regulate corporations. And one thing that they could do is pass a law providing that corporations go through certain procedures if they want to engage in corporate speech. Now, the good or bad thing about this tying back together between corporate speech and shareholder speech is that identifying what shareholders want is actually a relatively expensive proposition. When corporations have to ask shareholders for permission to do certain things, such as to amend their charter or there are other things where corporations do have to go to shareholders, it's actually quite expensive to identify all your shareholders, to contact them all, and then to get their votes on a particular process. And so, what this would do is this would essentially probably make corporate speech a lot less attractive to corporations and it would reduce their incentive to be engaged in corporate speech. And so this would be consistent with the Constitution. The language of Citizens United makes it clear that shareholders do have rights within corporations and that this is the kind of proposal that would be consistent with the First Amendment. In some way, I would argue, would be more consistent with the First Amendment because it really relates back to the shareholders and their ability to engage in corporate speech. And so, again, this would be a proposal that could be passed by legislation alone. If remember back to our discussion of the filibuster. If the filibuster was ever limited, this would be one of the best examples of something where maybe the filibuster could be limited, would be fundamental political rights such as free speech. And this is something that could be passed by Congress if they just could be convinced that this is something that enough people wanted. And so this is a proposal that I think would be popular. And any candidate who got behind this proposal would, I think, find a lot of enthusiasm for their candidacy.
It's great. Thank you so much, Ken. So, if I had to kind of summarize the journey we went on, today, corporations have free speech rights through Citizens United. Doesn't really make sense against the backdrop of why we have free speech rights and why we wanted kind of corporations to have free speech rights. It's deeply unpopular because while the amounts of money that it unlocks is huge, it's from a small number of entities. So popularity is not there. Politicians may be disincentivized to meet that hurdle in order to pass an amendment, but a legislation to seek shareholder affirmation of such speech is one, more consistent with the First Amendment, and also two, more likely to reduce corporate speech dramatically, three, more likely to pass. And then kind of my last takeaway is if anyone listening missed the filibuster episode, they should go back and take a listen to that because that's what would unlock the ability for us to move forward on this one. So thanks so much, Ken. Thanks to everybody listening. We're looking forward to digging in on the last two of these with you all. To get in touch with us or to give us your feedback, feel free to leave comments, subscribe, especially if you're enjoying the content. And you're always welcome to please email us at production@constitutionpod.com. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sadhna.